Most people see the patches first, then the boots, then the arms the size of bridge cables folded across a chest that looks like it was built to hold something back. They see leather worn black at the elbows. They see a skull on a vest with wings spread wide. They see danger. They see a reason to take another table. They see someone who does not belong in the same room as decent people. But on a Tuesday in late November, at 9:15 in the evening, in a roadside bar on the edge of Delwood, Missouri, a town small enough that the single traffic light downtown still blinks yellow after 8, Dorothy Atkins saw something very different when she looked at the man in the corner booth. She saw someone who had paid for his beer with the exact change. She saw someone reading a worn paperback with a cracked spine, turning pages slowly, the way a man does when he has nowhere urgent to be. She saw someone who had ordered the same thing she had. And so she did something that no one who witnessed it could fully explain afterward. She told the bartender to put his tab on hers. What happened next would change a Tuesday night in Delwood into the kind of story that gets told at dinner tables for 20 years. The Rusty Spoke had been on Route 61 since 1974, and it looked every day of its age. The bar sat back from the highway behind a gravel lot wide enough for a dozen trucks, separated from the cornfields on either side by a row of old oaks that had grown so large their roots had cracked the lot's asphalt into a puzzle. Inside, the lights were the warm amber of old incandescent bulbs that nobody had switched to LED because nobody wanted to see the place too clearly. The smell was burnt coffee from the machine that never got turned off, and something wood smoke underneath it, coming from a chimney that drew badly. There was a jukebox in the corner that still took quarters, still had Merle Haggard, still had 3 of the buttons stuck. On cold nights like this one, and it was cold, a proper Missouri November with the kind of wind that came flat off the plains with nothing to slow it down, the Rusty Spoke filled to perhaps half its 30 seats. A couple of men in work jackets at the bar, nursing bottles. A woman at the far end scrolling through her phone, waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. 4 men in a booth at the back of the room, leather vests, quiet, who had come in together and taken their beers without incident and done exactly nothing since. This was the kind of bar that once had a full parking lot on a Friday night, where the jukebox ran through its queue twice before last call, and the waitress, there had been a waitress. Before it became just the bartender, before things got quiet, used to know everyone's order before they sat down. That Delwood was 30 years gone now. What remained was a town that didn't look up when strangers passed through. A bar that stayed open out of habit as much as profit, and a Tuesday night that felt like all the other Tuesday nights. Gideon Reyes had been on Route 61 since 7 that morning, riding north from Joplin where he'd spent the weekend at a chapter memorial for a brother who died in August. He was 44 years old, 6'2", with a face that had been weathered by weather, and something that wasn't weather. The patches on his vest said things that required no translation. Iron Brotherhood, MC, Missouri, Sergeant at Arms. 22 years. He had a broad, quiet way of occupying a space, the kind of presence that makes other people in a room recalibrate without knowing why. The way a temperature drop of 3 degrees doesn't announce itself but gets felt in the back of the neck. When he'd pushed through the door of the Rusty Spoke at 9:05, the 2 men at the bar had not continued their conversation for several seconds. He'd chosen the booth against the wall, back to the corner, eyes on the room. He'd ordered a beer and a coffee, reading glasses already on his nose, the paperback he'd had in his jacket for 3 days finally getting read now that he was off the road. He'd planned to stop only long enough to warm up. He was heading toward Kansas City, and a bed he hadn't slept in for 4 nights. He wanted 30 quiet minutes and a hot cup of coffee, and to stop thinking about the memorial and what it meant to stand in a cold cemetery and think about a man who was 51 years old and should not have been in the ground yet. He had been carrying that weight since Saturday. He was still carrying it. Before we get to what happened next, and you're going to want to be here for this, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. Wherever you're watching from, you're part of this. Drop it below. I read every single one. Now, back to Dorothy. Because what she was about to do had nothing to do with not knowing better. It had everything to do with knowing exactly what she was doing. Dorothy Evelyn Atkins was 73 years old, and she had lived within 15 miles of Delwood for every one of those years. She had been married for 41 of them to a man named Earl Atkins, who drove a delivery route and had hands like shovels and a laugh that could be heard from the driveway before he got through the door. Earl had been gone for 3 years in December. 3 years felt, some evenings like 3 months. Other evenings it felt like a century. She had raised 2 sons in a house 6 miles east on Miller Road. Both sons had moved on, one to St. Louis, one to Phoenix, and they called on Sundays with a conscientiousness that she appreciated, and a distance that was not their fault and not anyone's fault, and was just how it was. She had worked 30 years as a school librarian at Delwood Elementary and had retired at 68 with a small ceremony and a card signed by 42 people. She still drove herself. She still went to church on Sunday mornings. She still kept a calendar on the refrigerator. Still hand-wrote birthday cards in the cursive she had taught herself at 12 from a book her mother owned. Still had a pot of African violets on the windowsill that she talked to on cold mornings, because she had read it helped, and because there was no one else to talk to at 6 in the morning. She had come to the Rusty Spoke because she came every second Tuesday. It was not the bar she would have chosen on her own. She was not a bar person. Had never been, but it was where she and Earl had gone for 30 years on the second Tuesday of every month. Always the same booth, always a beer each and then coffee and then pie. She still came. It would have felt like a surrender to stop. The bartender, whose name was Mike, and who was 30 years younger than she was, always had her usual ready and always said, "Evening, Mrs. Atkins," when she came in, and this small continuity mattered more than she could have explained to either of her sons. She had a habit, Earl had teased her for it her whole life, of noticing when other people were alone. Not lonely, necessarily, just alone. She was not sure there was always a difference. She had noticed Gideon Reyes the moment he came in. Not for the reasons that made the men at the bar go quiet. She noticed him because he had the particular stillness of someone who is used to his own company, and because he ordered his beer and his coffee at the same time, which was what she always did, and because he had taken out a book, and because he looked, beneath the leather and the size of him, like someone who was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. She watched him for 20 minutes. She was not staring. She was being a librarian, which is to say she was reading a room the way other people read text, carefully and with attention to what went unsaid. When Mike came over to settle her tab, she asked him to add the man in the corner to it. Mike had looked at her with an expression that said several things at once. "You sure?" he said. "He's been nursing that same beer for an hour," she said. "And he doesn't look like he's in a celebrating mood. Get him another." The door opened at 9:47, and the night that had been going along quietly became something else. His name was Craig Bellamy, and he was the kind of man that small towns produce with a depressing regularity. The one who learned, early enough that it became reflex, that confidence performed loudly enough can substitute for everything it is not. He was 48. He worked in property management 3 counties over, and dressed the way men dress when they want a room to notice them. a sport coat over a collared shirt, tan slacks, shoes that were wrong for gravel. He had the unhurried manner of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted from the people around him, not through threat exactly, but through the steady application of a social pressure that most people found easier to give into than to resist. He had not come in alone. A younger man came in behind him, early 30s, quieter, carrying himself as Bellamy's echo. Bellamy scanned the room and found what he was looking for immediately. His face did something that was not quite a smile when he found it. He walked to Dorothy's booth. She had seen him come in. She had not looked away because she was not the kind of woman who looked away, and she was not going to start at 73. "Dorothy," he said, not asking. "Craig," she said. He sat down across from her without being invited. His associate took the edge of the booth beside him and said nothing. Craig Bellamy had been trying, in his particular way, to acquire the house on Miller Road for the better part of 18 months. It was a fair-sized property on a corner lot. Earl had bought it in 1981 for almost nothing, and it was worth considerably more now. And Bellamy had been making offers through a property management company and through a nephew who worked at the county title office, the way these things get done in small counties. Dorothy had declined each approach, not rudely. Simply, "You didn't return my call," he said. "I didn't," she said. "I've been patient, Dorothy. You've been persistent," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." He smiled the way he smiled when he was past the portion of a conversation he was willing to have politely. He set his phone on the table, screen up. "I had a conversation with David Harmon at the county assessor's office this week," he said. "You know David." She did. Everyone in Delwood County knew David Harmon. "There are some questions," Bellamy said, "about the estate filing from 3 years ago. Some irregularities. It may be nothing." He paused. "It may not be. The thing about a specific kind of pressure is that it does not need to be a threat. It only needs to be a suggestion. A nudge toward a door that has been quietly left open." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you should go, Craig. I think," he said, "that you should consider the position you're putting yourself in." He reached across the table and picked up her coffee cup, her coffee, and moved it to the far edge of the table, beyond her reach. It was a small thing, a thing he probably did not think about, the gesture of a man who was accustomed to moving things that weren't his. She looked at the cup, then at him. 4 people at the bar saw it happen. 4 people looked at something else. Gideon Reyes had not been looking at the booth in the corner. He had been reading. He was 40 pages from the end of the book, and the bar was quiet, and the coffee was adequate, and he had not been paying attention to the room the way he normally did, because it was a Tuesday, and the room was half empty, and nothing had suggested that paying attention was necessary. He heard it. Not the words, the room was not quiet enough for that. He heard the register. He knew the register. He had a younger sister in St. Louis who had an ex-husband with the same register. He had learned, in the years between his sister's marriage and her escape from it, to recognize it from across a room. The specific modulation of a voice that is not quite threatening, that stays civilized enough to maintain plausible deniability, that applies pressure through the performance of reasonableness. He set his book down. He did not move yet. He looked at the booth without appearing to look at it, the way he had learned to look at things that needed watching. He watched the man in the sport coat move the woman's coffee cup. He watched her face. He watched the younger man at the edge of the booth, positioned to block the exit without being positioned there in any way that would read as intentional. He watched the woman, older, composed, back straight, not flinching, say something. He watched the man's smile not change. Gideon Reyes set his glasses down beside his book. He set his coffee mug down. Nobody in that room saw what was coming. He stood. The booth creaked once with the redistribution of weight. He was to his full height before the creak had finished, 6'2" and 230, the vest reading in the amber light like a flag from a country that had its own laws. He walked across the room in the way he walked, not slow to be dramatic, slow because slow was what he was. And he stopped at the end of Dorothy's booth. He looked at Craig Bellamy. Bellamy looked up. For 3 seconds, neither of them said anything. The men at the bar had gone still. Mike behind the bar had gone still. "Is she asking you to stay?" Gideon said. It was 6 words. It was a question. It was the quietest thing in the room. Bellamy looked at him with the expression of a man processing a miscalculation. He looked at the patches. He looked at the size. He looked at the face, which was not angry, which was the part that was frightening. No anger, no performance, just attention. "This is a private conversation," Bellamy said. "She asked you to go," Gideon said. Bellamy's associate started to say something. Gideon did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Bellamy, and the not looking at the associate was its own statement. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Bellamy said. Gideon pulled Dorothy's coffee cup back across the table to where it had been. He said nothing. Bellamy stood up. He straightened his sport coat. He looked at his associate, and then at Gideon, and then at Dorothy. And his expression was the expression of a man who has decided that this particular conversation can be resumed at a better time and place, which was the only way men like Bellamy knew how to lose. "We're not finished," he said to Dorothy. Gideon sat down in the booth across from her, settling his weight into the seat with the finality of something placed there permanently. "Yes," he said, "you are." Bellamy stood for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked toward the door, his associate behind him, and he pushed out into the cold. The room exhaled. Dorothy looked at the man across from her. He had already picked up her coffee cup and extended it toward her, without ceremony. Just the small gesture of returning a thing to its proper place. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "I'm Dorothy," she said. "Gideon," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You're the man whose tab I paid." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. "That was you," he said. "It was." "Why?" She considered this. "You looked like you'd been riding a long time," she said, "and like the day had been heavy, and like you didn't have anyone to buy you a drink." She paused. "I know what that feels like." He was quiet. Then he said, "My condolences about your husband." She blinked. "How did you?" "The bartender told me," he said, "when he brought the beer." He looked at the table. "I lost my road captain in August. It's not the same thing. But I've been thinking about it since Joplin." The bar was quiet around them. The jukebox clicked through to a new song. Neither of them spoke for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Bellamy came back 22 minutes later. He came through the door with 4 men this time. 3 of them were large. One of them had on a county sheriff department jacket, the kind that doesn't mean you work for the county but means you want people to think you might. His miscalculation had festered in the cold and come back in a different form. He crossed the room and stopped at the booth and looked at Gideon with a confidence rebuilt on new arithmetic. "I'd like you to leave," he said. Gideon picked up his coffee cup. "The lady owns property we're in a legal dispute about," Bellamy said. "You're interfering in a legal matter. That's a problem." He looked at the man in the county jacket. The man stood slightly forward, the way props get used. Gideon set the coffee mug down. He looked at Bellamy's 4 men. He looked at Bellamy. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was small and quiet, and it was the first genuine smile of the evening, and it was the most frightening thing that had happened in the Rusty Spoke in a long time. "Okay," he said. He reached into his vest pocket and took out his phone. He sent one text. Then he put the phone face down on the table. Bellamy watched this. "What did you just do?" "Nothing," Gideon said. "Who did you text?" "Nobody," Gideon said. From outside, from a long way down Route 61, a sound began. Low at first, low enough to mistake for wind, low enough to seem like imagination. Then building, the way something builds when it is many and moving. A vibration that reached the windows of the Rusty Spoke before it reached the ears. The glasses on the bar began to tremble fractionally against each other. The jukebox hummed against its own casing. Gideon looked at Bellamy. "You may want to think," he said, "about your next move." Outside, headlights appeared on Route 61. One pair. Then three. Then what the brain struggled to count, because there were too many to track individually. The gravel lot began to fill with the sound of engines. Not roaring, not aggressive, just present and steady. The sound of an enormous thing arriving at its own pace. Bellamy's 4 men were looking at the windows. Bellamy was looking at Gideon, who had picked up his book again and was reading it. "What is that?" Bellamy said. Gideon turned a page. "Tuesday night," he said. Engines cut, one after another, until the parking lot outside was filled with silence and chrome. 29 motorcycles in a lot built for 12 trucks. The kind of silence that 30 motorcycles make when 30 engines stop at almost the same moment is not the absence of sound. It is its own sound, weighted and particular, carrying the memory of everything it just was. The door opened. The man who came in first was named Salvatore Ortega, and he was 56 years old and had been on the road since he was 19, and had the face of a man who had negotiated his way through a great many difficult rooms. He wore the same vest as Gideon. Road captain. His eyes did the room in 3 seconds. Bellamy and his men against the wall, the bartender behind the bar, Dorothy in the booth. And then they found Gideon, and some of the assessment dropped out of his expression and something warmer replaced it. "Brother," he said. Gideon set his book down and stood, and they embraced the way men embrace who have not seen each other in months, with both arms and no performance. Sal pulled back and looked at him. "You look terrible," he said. "Memorial was rough," Gideon said. "Yeah," Sal nodded. "It was." His eyes dropped to Dorothy, seated in the booth, watching this with the composed attention of a woman who has decided to understand what she is seeing before she reacts to it. Something in Sal's expression shifted, the road-worn calculation softening at the corners. "This the lady? Dorothy Atkins," Gideon said. "Dorothy, this is Sal." Sal held out a hand. Dorothy shook it. "Thank you," Sal said, "for buying my brother a drink." Behind him, the door had been opening steadily, leather and cold air and the smell of November and exhaust, and the quiet of men who don't need to announce themselves. The Rusty Spoke had 22 seats and was currently holding 31 people who did not fit into 22 seats, and none of them were asking anyone to move. Mike behind the bar was looking at this with the expression of a man who was going to have a story to tell for the rest of his life. Bellamy's 4 men had rearranged themselves near the door in a way that said they were reconsidering the situation. The man in the county jacket was no longer standing forward. Bellamy himself stood very still. He was doing the calculation that men like Bellamy do, the one that sorts the world into leverage and no leverage, and the calculation was not returning useful numbers. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Sal. He looked at the room, which was fully occupied by people in Iron Brotherhood patches, who were paying him no attention whatsoever, whose total indifference to his presence was more absolute than any threat could have been. He had come back for a second conversation. He was not going to get one. He said nothing. He walked to the door. His 4 men went ahead of him. He pushed out into the cold without looking back, which was the first honest thing he had done all evening. The door swung closed behind him. The room settled. Someone laughed at the back of the group. A short, quiet laugh of the kind that comes when a long breath finally releases. Mike behind the bar said something about getting more glasses. Sal sat down across from Dorothy with the ease of a man who sits down in unfamiliar places for a living, and somebody pulled a chair up to the end of the booth, and somebody else asked if the jukebox took quarters. And the Rusty Spoke on a Tuesday night became something it hadn't been in a long while. Dorothy looked at Gideon. "Do they always do this?" she asked. "Do what?" "Just show up." He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "That's what they do." Craig Bellamy was escorted from Delwood County within a month. The property management company he'd operated through lost 3 contracts after an inquiry was opened into land practices in the county. An inquiry that had been filed, according to public record, by 4 different property owners in the same week. The nephew at the county title office resigned in January. The assessor's office found no irregularities in the estate filing from 3 years ago, because there were none to find. Dorothy Atkins drove herself home that night at 11:15 in a car that felt different to sit in, though she could not have said exactly why. She unlocked the door of the house on Miller Road, the house Earl had bought in 1981, and went inside, and turned on the lights, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her coat still on. Then she picked up the phone and called her son in St. Louis, even though it was late. Because she wanted to hear his voice, and because she had decided not to wait until Sunday. Gideon Reyes left Delwood at 11:30 with 29 motorcycles behind him, riding north toward Kansas City in a formation that stretched the length of Route 61 for a quarter mile. The temperature was 11 degrees, and the wind was flat off the plains, and it hit the riders full in the face, and not one of them turned back. He had been riding toward something for 4 days. He was not certain, by the time he reached the highway, that he was still riding toward the same thing. Sal rode up beside him on the interstate. He said something that the wind took before it arrived. Gideon looked at him. Sal shrugged, the way men shrug when what they mean is, "You already know." He did. The formation stretched down the highway, 30 headlights in the dark, and from a distance it looked like something purposeful and specific, which it was. Some people think that decency has conditions, that it requires the right clothes, the right background, the right kind of face, that it arrives from people who look the way it's supposed to look. But a Tuesday in Delwood, Missouri, a town small enough to blink through, at a bar that's been losing its crowd for 30 years, says otherwise. Decency showed up in a wool coat and birthday card cursive and a bar tab paid for a stranger. It showed up in a man who set his book down and stood slowly and asked a simple question. And it showed up in the sound of 30 engines on Route 61, cutting out all at once in a parking lot full of chrome, for a woman that every single one of them had met for the first time that night. Nobody needed to explain it. Nobody needed to announce it. It just arrived, the way the right things sometimes do, quiet and certain, and on its own schedule. If this story reached you tonight, if you believe that goodness still shows up in unexpected places, and that no one is ever quite as alone as the world makes them feel, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment below. Would you have done what Dorothy did? Type Guardian if this one stayed with you. I read every single one.